Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem.
This is Terumos, Chapter 3, Halacha 5, and the art scroll we're on 32a1. This is a short shear, but it's very dense. There's a lot going on here. It's really like a diamond, and while it's very short, it's deceptively complicated. So, concerning the laws of a non-Jew who is going to be separating truma, what's going to be the status of the truma? Did they separate out truma or not? There's a lot of malokets that are going on over here. So one of them comes up in Masechet Shvius in chapter 6, Halacha 1, talking about what about the status of Eretz Yisrael and the land? Can a non-Jew own pieces of Eretz Yisrael? The sages say yes. And what about, but there is Rabbi Shimon who says no, and a few others who say no. And what about the Kedusha? Does the ownership of the land affect the Kedusha? So does it require tithes? Another thing that's coming up is what happens if a non-Jew grew the product and then a Jew acquired it, he purchased the grain. Now is it going to be subject to tithes? And that's also going to be the sub-theme here about what about the Kedusha of the land? Is that something that went away when a non-Jew owns the land? Can a non-Jew own the land? Or is the Kedusha going to be intrinsic to the land, so whoever is growing on it, there's going to be an element of Kedusha on it. So the Mishnah starts off and it says, concerning a non-Jew and a Cuthian. Cuthian is put in here because it's a thing of suffix. In the law, they went and they converted. They were brought here by the Babylonians, and they converted, but there was always a question, was it a real conversion or not? And Rabban Gamliel says that it was. Later, Rebbe went ahead and said that it was not when they found idols. Anyway, it has a complicated status in the halacha, and sometimes they're more strict on laws, sometimes they're more lenient on laws. So it's saying a non-Jew and a Cuthian, that their truma is valid truma, their tithes are valid tithes, and their consecrations are valid consecrations. Now, what happens if a non-Jew consecrates an animal as a sacrificial offering? By the way, they can only separate and offer out an olah. That's going to be a completely burnt offering. Everything is burnt up. There's nothing that they're allowed to eat. But, can he consecrate a voluntary offering? And, the question is here, as it's connecting back to Zevachim in page 45, that it's basically implying that yes, a non-Jew's consecration is valid, but there's a question: does it have the same level of sanctity as the consecration as a Jew? And this is a maloket and a conversation that comes up in the Gemara in Zevachim. In other words, that it might have the same status as being a consecrated animal, but maybe the level's a little bit lower. And the question is, well, what about now the truma, right? If the non-Jew separates and tithes truma from his own produce, okay, it's saying that it's valid, but what about if a Jew comes in and eats the non-Jew's truma? Is he going to be liable to a fifth? We know that if a Jew eats the truma of another Jew or his own truma, he has to pay a 1/5 penalty to the Kohanim. So is that also going to account for the non-Jews' truma? Is that also going to be there? So really what it's trying to do is just trying to probe what is the status of it. And the Mishnah now gets into related topics. What about the laws of Revai? In other words, that's going to be the fourth year produce from fruit. And what about for non-Jews' produce? And Rabbi Yudah says that a non-Jew does not have Revai of the vineyards. And the sages say that he does have the Revai of a vineyard. So the grapes that grow from a non-Jew's vine during the fourth year, after they're planted, they're not going to be subject to these laws. This comes up in a Tosefet in Demai in 524, and in the Yerushalmi it's 5:8. And Rabbi Yudah is saying that the non-Jew's acquisition of land in Eretz Yisrael is going to affect the land's sanctity. That's what it's saying. So because it affects the sanctity, Rabbi Yudah is going to be saying that a grape that's grown on the vine is no different than a grape grown on the vine of a Jew outside of Eretz Yisrael, and the grapes that are grown outside of Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yehuda says, are not subject to vine. So, by the way, during the first 3 years of the vine's growth, the grapes are forbidden as orlah, and orlah is going to apply to produce that is, by the way, grown outside of Eretz Yisrael. Now, the sages are going to disagree, and they're going to say that the non-Jew's acquisition of land in Eretz Yisrael does not affect the sanctity of the land, so that the grape that's grown on his vine is no different than a grape grown on the vine of a Jew in Eretz Yisrael. And because the land just produces produce that has Kedusha, it's going to be subject to the laws of Rivai. So this is going to take, a big question about what about, Shvias as well. There's an opinion that the produce that's grown over here from the Masechet Shvias also has Kedusha. So the question is, what about the status of the land, and the status of what's grown, and is what's being grown going to have Kedusha, whether it's done by a Jew or non-Jew? And the sages say that the land always produces things with Kedusha. It doesn't matter who owns it. Now, the Mishnah is going to talk about the Truma separated by a non-Jew. And again, we're trying to dig into what is the status of it. Is it going to have the same weight as the Truma of a Jew? They're saying that it is Truma. But what about the other laws of Truma? Is it also going to carry that? So the Mishnah says that the Truma of a non-Jew renders a mixture of meduma. Meduma, by the way, is a forbidden mixture that is partially Truma and partially Hulin. And by Torah law, the Truma is nullified in the majority of Hulin, but the rabbis said that only in a Hulin, the Truma mixture of 101. And the Tanna Kam is teaching that the Truma of a non-Jew, which is biblical Truma, is treated exactly the same as the Truma of a Jew, which is going to be nullified only in a ratio of 100 to 1. And the Mishnah continues, and it says, and also the non-Kohanim are liable to a surcharge of a fifth for eating it. So the Mishnah is bringing up and is teaching that if a non-Jew accidentally eats his own Truma, he has to repay the Truma that he ate plus an additional fifth. And by the way, that's going to also hold by what happens if a Jew eats the Truma of a non-Jew. Is it going to have the same status as the Truma of a Jew? And they're saying that he's going to be liable to the surcharge of a fifth. So basically what this is saying is that the Truma of a non-Jew is treated exactly the same as the Truma of a Jew. And so that if a non-Kohen eats the Truma, or a Jew eats the Truma, in addition to replacing the Truma that's lost, the Mara Fulda says that he's obligated in the surcharge of a fifth, just as somebody who inadvertently ate the Truma separated by a Jew, or if the Jew ate the Truma for a non-Jew. In other words, that they're saying that it's the same. Now, there's a dissent. Rabbi Shimon exempts someone who ate the Truma designated by a non-Jew from paying an additional fifth. This is complicated because Rabbi Shimon's arguing that a non-Jew's Truma is not treated exactly as a Truma of a Jew, and we're going to get into the rationale for Rabbi Shimon and how the Tanna Kama is going to argue with that. So the Gemara starts off, and it was talking about the part of the Mishnah, talking about the status of a non-Jew's designation as Truma, and it's saying that the tithe is going to be effective. There's a lot here, and there's a lot going on here. Again, is what's coming out of the non-Jew's land. First of all, can the non-Jew own land? And according to the sages, does that affect the Kedusha? Is when he separates it out, is it going to be having a status that it has Kedusha, you got to separate it out. And the Gemara is going to talk about Brisa where three cases are discussed. And it says that if a non-Jew brought out to the Kohanim the Truma from his home, that they treat it as both Tevel and Truma. These are the words of Rebbe. But Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that the produce is treated as definite Truma. Now, there's a lot going on here. Now, we're talking about, you have a non-Jew that they learned the laws of separating out tithes. In other words, they're saying that the guy went and he studied how much are you taking out, how do you handle it, who do you give it to, and basically Shimon ben Gamliel is saying that the produce is treated as definite truma. Why? Because he's saying that the non-Jew went and learned the laws accurately enough to be able to do it. He knows the laws. He knows the percentages. And the fact that he's going ahead and separating these things out, it's saying that because he went and learned the laws, he's following it and he can be relied upon. And according to Rebbe, only a Goan can, eat produce since it may be truma. And what Rebbe is basically saying, Rebbe is basically making a demai argument. Rebbe is coming along and saying that, look, we treat the separations of an Amma Aretz as being a suffix. And so you have to go out and separate these things out again because, there might be tevel inside of it. Or maybe it is truma, or maybe it's tevel. And so he's saying that the non-Jew, maybe he doesn't know the laws as well. And maybe it's going to be more like the Amma Aretz, where we do the same thing for a Jew who doesn't learn as much or doesn't know as much. Maybe they're not exactly accurate on the laws because he's not a haver. And if he's not a haver, we have a suffix, we have a doubt. So we're going to treat it as both and force you to tithe it again. That's basically going to be the argument of Rebbe. And again, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, no, it's not really demai. That he'll say that that's true for the Amma Aretz, but not in the case of the non-Jew who went and learned the laws and is coming to separate it out. And he's saying that this produce is definite truma. Now, again, the case here, says Amara Fulda, is where you have a non-Jew who brought produce to a Goan, and he's claiming that it's designated as truma. And there's a lot of issues that's coming up here because can the non-Jew's declaration be trusted? In other words, it's not that the guy's a dishonest guy, but it's that, hey, wait a second, the laws of separations are very complex. Maybe the guy didn't get it right. Maybe implicit in there is a demua. I'll give you an example, a mixture, right? So if you have 100 sa'ah of grain, right, and you separate out your 2%, so you take 2 out for the Truma Gedola. And now you're coming along and you're saying, the guy comes along and says, here's 10 sa'ah of Meiser Rishon. Well, the correct tithe is supposed to be 9.8. It's not supposed to be 10 sa'ah. It's supposed to be 9.8. So, again, how do you know that the guy separated accurately? Now, if the guy's handing over 10 instead of 9.8, one part of the pile has definite tevel. And so this really does look a lot like a demai issue. So the second case goes like this, and it really parallels the first, but in the next set of tithes. And it says, if a non-Jew brought out to Jews the next set of tithes, which is going to be the Meiser Rishon from his home, and he's basically coming and he's declaring, hey, here's some Meiser Rishon tithe. So the Gemara says that they treat it as both tevel and Meiser Rishon. These are the words of Rebbe. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that one must remove from it only truma. In other words, Rebbe is unsure about the tithe, and he's saying, yeah, it might be Meiser Rishon, but it might be tevel. And he's going to say that you have to go separate out all the tithes because there's a suffix. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, on the other hand, is arguing that there's no question as to the Meiser Rishon status. And he's going to be agreeing that the truma has to be removed, but he's basically saying that, again, this guy went ahead and learned the laws of the percentages for Meiser Rishon. And so we're going to say that his declaration is a valid declaration and he can be trusted. Why can he be trusted as opposed to the Amma Aretz who can't be trusted on this? Because he's saying, because of the fact that this non-Jew went ahead and learned the laws and he's coming and making a declaration, we can trust that he took the information and he's doing it accurately. That's the idea. Again, Rebbe is coming along and saying, well, the laws are complicated, and just like for a non-Jew and for a Jew who's not as learned, we're going to have a suffix on it. You're going to have to separate out tithes and treat it like demai. Same thing for the non-Jew, because these are very complicated, and it's not a haver. It's not a person who sits and learns and knows the laws accurately. you have to treat it as a case of a suffix. There's a final case, and it goes down to the next set of tithes. And it says if a non-Jew brought out from them Meiser Sheni from his home, they treat it as both Tevel and Meiser Sheni. These are the words of Rebbe. And Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says that one must remove from it only Truma and Meiser Rishon, but basically they're saying that, that this is going to be trusted as Meiser Sheni. And again, the argument's going to be, Rebbe and Shimon ben Gamliel disagree on the produce's status. Rebbe's unsure if it's going to be Tevel or Meiser Sheni, and therefore, does it have to be, eaten in Jerusalem or redeemed? And it's not permitted until all the tithes are removed. And then on the other hand, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is certain that it's Meiser Sheni, but nevertheless he's going to agree that the Truma and Meiser Rishon should be removed. And how can these two views work, right? So the Gemara is going to talk about the underlying reason of each. Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Bun, says that in all three cases, Rebbe rules that the produce has to be treated as possible tevel, but he's concerned that perhaps the non-Jew separated tithes from one species on behalf of another species, thus invalidating the tithe. So we learned before in chapter 2 that you have to remove truma and other tithes from one type of food on behalf of another type of food that's the same status or from the same type. And if he didn't do it, then the truma doesn't take effect. So Rebbe's worried that maybe, the non-Jew is saying the truth, but Rebbe is concerned that maybe the non-Jew is unaware of this particular law, and he removed tithes from one food on behalf of another type of food, which made the tithe void. And he's basically ruling that in all three cases, the produce is treated as possible tevel. Maybe he didn't do the tithing in the right way, didn't know that particular law, and while he was very well intentioned, it ends up where maybe it's not fully tithed, or maybe it's not tithed at all. And so because of this uncertainty, the non-Jew, where he's claiming that it's truma, the produce has to be treated as truma, but Rebbe's saying it also has to be treated as tevel because maybe he didn't know the law. And the same with the case of Meiser Rishon and also with Meiser Sheni. Now, Rabban Gamliel is taking a different approach. He's saying that the non-Jew must be aware of this basic law that tithes must be removed from one type of food on behalf of the other type of food. And basically what he's saying is, that, look, because the non-Jew is coming and learning the laws of tithes, it must be that he's learning this law as well, that it has to be on the same kind of food. Otherwise, it's not going to be a valid tithe. And so he's saying that it must be because he's coming and taking the voluntary step to go and learn it, that the non-Jews' tithes are going to be, treated as exactly what the non-Jew says it is. Now, if the non-Jew is inverting the sequence and changing it up, and he's coming out and he's saying that, oh well, maybe I took this tithe in advance of that one. Now maybe there's going to be other issues because now the percentages are going to be off. So the Gemara is going to continue on that point, and it's going to say that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is concerned only that perhaps the non-Jew inverted the proper tithing sequence. So in other words, we know that Truma Gedola comes first, and then Meiser Rishon comes second, and then Meiser, the Truma Meiser comes third, and then the Meiser Sheni comes last. And he's saying that, look, maybe the guy got confused, and maybe he moved this one ahead of that one. And then you're going to end up with a Demai issue because, you got to get the percentages right. And so, by tithing one ahead of the other, if you didn't get the percentages right, you end up for sure with a mixture. That we learned in Demai. And, that's something that he's worried about. And so, but there's no question in the mind of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel that, if the produce is tithed exactly in the right order, that the tithe of the non-Jew is exactly what he claims it to be. And, the idea that Rabban Gamliel is saying, where he's saying that the the non-Jews identifying the Meiser Rishon, or the Truma must be still removed. Since the Meiser Rishon may have been designated out of order, then basically what he's saying is that you still have to take out a tithe, because maybe he got the order wrong. Maybe he tithed it out of order. And if he did tithe it out of order and he got the percentages wrong, then he has to go, we learned this in the second Demai, he has to go get another pile of grain and tithe this for that. So once you've tithed it out of order, and you end up where there's a little piece that ends up being unable to get rectified within the pile that you have to get another pile to go fix it. So the worry is that maybe he didn't get the order right. Maybe he mixed it up, and that's why he's saying, look, you have to tithe the other tithe, because maybe it's out of order. But he's saying that, look, the guy comes and says that it's truma. He's saying it's truma. Now, when he's getting to the other sets of tithes, now there comes in some complexity. And so now he's saying, if you're giving Meiser Rishon, now you have to give the Truma. Why? Because maybe he did the Meiser Rishon first and then the Truma second. So anyway, then the Mishnah gets to the next part, that the Truma of a non-Jew renders a mixture of meduma, and the non-Kohen is liable to a surcharge of a fifth for eating it. And Rabbi Shimon is going to exempt somebody who eats Truma designated from a non-Jew from paying a fifth. And let's get into the dispute between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Shimon. Again, we're trying to understand what is the status of the non-Jew's tithe. Is it going to have equal status with the Jew? So Rabbi Zera said that I stated before Rabbi Abahu in the name of Rabbi Yochanan regarding what case do they disagree. And it says that it's regarding the truma of the non-Jew's own granary. In other words, the truma of the produce that grew in his own field. And specifically, this is the case that Rabbi Shimon exempts a non-Kohen from paying the surcharge. And the Gemara says, but with respect to truma designated by a non-Jew who purchased it from a Jew, Rabbi Shimon concedes, says the Gemara, that the non-Kohanim are liable to a surcharge of a fifth for eating it. So the Mishnah began talking about, the status of a non-Jew's designation as truma and how it's recognized, by Torah law. And accordingly, the truma separation by a non-Jew should be treated exactly as the truma designation by a Jew, and should be subject to the same law, which would be that if somebody accidentally goes and eats it, you have to replace the portion that's eaten, and you have to pay a 1/5 penalty. So he's saying that this would apply not only to the Jews' truma, but also to the non-Jews' truma. It's exactly the same. So why is it that Rabbi Shimon's arguing? And the Pnei Moshe is explaining that the Gemara is holding that, in fact, Rabbi Shimon agrees that a non-Jew's truma designation is recognized by Torah law, but he's arguing that his produce is not liable to truma by Torah law because a non-Jew's acquisition of land in Eretz Yisrael does affect the land's sanctity, so that the produce grown by a non-Jew in Eretz Yisrael is biblically exempt from tithes. This, by the way, comes up in the Yerushalmi Daf. You can find it in the article on page 48, talking about Rabbi Shimon explaining his view over there. And basically over here, since Rabbi Shimon is saying that the produce of a non-Jew that was now purchased by a Jew after the tithing obligation took effect is basically going to be where, it's subject to truma by biblical law. And Rabbi Shimon's going to be saying that a non-Jew who eats it is liable to a surcharge of a fifth, but he's disagreeing only on the produce grown from the non-Jew's own field. And so in that case, he's arguing that although the produce grown in a non-Jew's field is subject to truma by rabbinic law, and he's saying that it is equal, but there's rabbinic restrictions on it. And Rabbi Shimon's only point is to say, hey, wait, Doraita, is this going to be the case Doraita? But Rabbi Shimon says that the outcome of the law is the same by a rabbinic fence. That's the argument. Hey, is there a rabbinic fence here or not? And the sages are basically saying, no, Doraita, this is the case. And Rabbi Shimon is saying, no, this is the same outcome in the law, but there's a rabbinic restriction on to get us there. So the Gemara is going to continue, and Rabbi Abahu says that it is not as you said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Rather, Rabbi Yochanan said that even this too is in dispute. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan, according to Rabbi Abahu, is saying that Rabbi Shimon argues that even concerning produce purchased from a Jew, it's going to be subject to tithes by biblical law. And according to this view, Rabbi Shimon's arguing that a non-Jew's designation is recognized to be at a lower status than the Jew's designation. And he's stating that someone who eats this kind of truma is not liable to the surcharge of a fifth. And why would that be? And the Gemara is going to actually challenge Rabbi Abahu's view, and it's going to say, but if so, then there's a difficulty with the position of Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon says that truma removed by a non-Jew exempts the produce purchased from a Jew and from its tevel prohibition, even on a biblical level. In other words, so that it's permitted to be eaten by a Jew. And the question is, and yet, at the same time, the Gemara says, and you'll say as well, that according to Rabbi Shimon, someone who eats this truma is not subject to the additional fifth. So how would that be possible? In other words, if the truma designation is going to be okay by biblical law and biblical obligation, so shouldn't it also be treated by, as biblical truma and subject to the surcharge of a fifth? And the Gemara is going to answer and, explain what this difficulty is. It's going to say, but are sacred offerings donated by a non-Jew not recognized as biblically valid offerings? They are. Of course they are. So we see this, by the way, in Zevachim, page 45. And the Gemara says, and yet Rabbi Shimon exempts them from many biblical strictnesses, as we learned in the Mishnah over there in Zevachim 45a, regarding the consecrated offerings of a non-Jew. And it's saying one is not liable on their account to the correct penalty for pigul or nasser, or eating it while it's temeh. And one who slaughters them outside the temple courtyard is not liable. These are the words of Rabbi Shimon. So pigul, by the way, is going to be a sacrifice that's offered with the improper intent, or for eating the meat, or offering its sacrificial parts on the altar after the time that's designated. And nasser, by the way, is going to be meat of the offering not consumed at the right time. And in the case of a Jew's offering, one is liable to karet for eating pigul or nasser meat, but not for the non-Jew. And according to Rabbi Shimon, these penalties do not apply to the offerings of a non-Jew. He's maintaining that the Torah's specification for Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, dealing with all these prohibitions. And again, that's the minority view. And the other view is going to be that, in fact, the non-Jews' offerings, you are liable for pigul or nasser. But the Gemara says that Rabbi Yossi argues and deems a person subject to the regular penalty for these transgressions. In other words, that a non-Jew's consecrated offering comes d'oraita from Vayikra 22:18, where it says that they will bring to Hashem. And according to Rabbi Yossi, these words are saying that these offerings are Hashem's, which is leading to the conclusion that they are subject to the same degree of stringency as offerings that are consecrated by a Jew. This you can find in Zevachim, in page 45b. And, while Rabbi Shimon is recognizing the truma over here of a non-Jew as biblical truma that, removes the tevel prohibition, nevertheless he's arguing over here that it's not subject to the same laws as truma. And Rabbi Yosei is saying that just like the non-Jews' truma or offerings have the same status and penalties as a regular Jew's offerings, over here the truma is going to be the same. So the Tanakh of the Mishnah is holding that a non-Jewish truma is subject to the laws of a meduma and the surcharge of a fifth. And the Gemara is going to clarify whether both aspects of the Tanakh ruling are disputed by Rabbi Shimon. And again, to sum up, the Tanakh is saying that the truma or consecrated offering of a non-Jew has exactly the same status, both in penalties as a sacrifice or offering or truma for a Jew. So when the Torah prescribes a fifth for eating the truma, it's not only for the Jews' truma, it's also going to be for the non-Jews' truma. In other words, the sages are saying truma is truma d'oraita. Now, the Gemara finishes up and it says that the students of the academy wish to say regarding, what did they disagree? What did the sages and Rabbi Shimon disagree about? They're saying regarding the surcharge of a fifth, but regarding the demua status of a mixture containing truma, they don't disagree. Rather, they're both going to agree that truma is going to, render a mixture meduma. In other words, the Mishnah is trying to impart that Rabbi Shimon argues concerning a meduma, and that the Mishnah is basically saying that, Rabbi Shimon is arguing with respect only to the surcharge of the fifth, and, with respect to the laws of a meduma, he's going to agree that, if the truma and a tithe mixture and an untithed mixture get mixed up by a non-Jew, that it's going to have the same status as a meduma, as a mixture. And according to this, Rabbi Shimon is basically going to be maintaining that the truma of a non-Jew is biblically sanctified to a lesser degree than the truma of a Jew. Why? Because Rabbi Shimon is going to be arguing that it's not subject to the fifth. But he's going to be saying and agreeing that a mixture is a mixture. And so because it's still sanctified on some level, that if it falls in, it's going to create a mixture. So the Gemara continues, and it says, regarding the surcharge of a fifth, they don't disagree. And later, however, they retracted for a Bryce, and they found that this law is like that law. In other words, Rabbi Shimon disagreed with the Tanakama with respect to both the surcharge of a fifth and the law of meduma. In other words, in looking at this further, they were saying, wait a second, how far does Rabbi Shimon go? And in the first version of this, Rabbi Shimon, it looked like, was saying that, look, the truma designation of a non-Jew still has kedusha on the biblical level. But if a Jew or a non-Jew eats it, he's not subject to a fifth. In other words, the penalty, because it's at a lower level, because the truma is at a lower level, you don't get the same penalty as the truma of a Jew. And he's saying, but still, because it has some level of kedusha, if it falls into a pile that's untithed, it created a mixture. That's the first version of Rabbi Shimon. But they found in a brisa that taught that no. That's not really what Rabbi Shimon meant. Rabbi Shimon is holding that the non-Jews' truma separation is actually not valid at all. In other words, if the truma of a non-Jew fell into tevel, into a untithed mixture, it doesn't create any mixture at all. Why? Because anyway, the tithing is invalid. Anyway, it's not only is it not subject to a fifth because of that lower status, it doesn't have any kedusha at all. Why? Because Rabbi Shimon is always holding that the produce that's done by a non-Jew it doesn't have any kedusha. Only a Jew can have land that produces produce that has kedusha. That's the view of Rabbi Shimon. So if a non-Jew has land and produces something in Eretz Yisrael, then it's never subject to tithes according to Rabbi Shimon because it doesn't have any kedusha. There's no sanctity to what's produced. And therefore, when you separate it out of tithe, there was no obligation to write according to Rabbi Shimon. And if it falls into the and creates a mixture, there's no mixture because anyway it was not subject. And anyway, this is a minority opinion, and the sages and the majority of the sages, and we go by the majority of sages, say that a non-Jew does have ownership in the land, and what is produced in the land does have kedusha, and that the truma designation is valid, and not only is it valid, but it's equal at the same status and the same level as a Jew's designation for truma. Have a great day.